I'm Joshua, and I'm an INTP. And first and foremost, I would like to say thank you for viewing this video and subsequently viewing my channel. The topic of this video will be on knowledge. And I'm making this video in respects to a previous video that I made and then subsequently deleted swiftly after its making because I was not content with the quality of the information and the way I phrased and structured my thoughts in that video, and felt as if it was incomplete and misleading. And I do not want to be the one to put out that type of information on the internet, and I felt if I received the impression from my own watching of it that it was self-glorifying, and I didn't like that either. So, but there was a comment put in that video on a very serious and salient view within my own cognitive and mental makeup per se, and it's leading to this, and it's led me to this video. And I've made a video on knowledge and on thoughts before, and it will be in the same manner or structure of that video, insofar as that it is about the limitations of knowledge, but per se, I want to go into this video about why the underlying beliefs that underpin that view, logically why I arrived there, and what it does for me as an individual, and why, though I will explicate the things I do explicate, I hold fastidiously to the truth and logic. Firstly and primarily, it's this, that all things that we experience as people come by way of our cognition and come by way of the brain. The physical world in reality, as we understand it and as we know it, is some representation that our brain presents to us. To us. There is the individual, but the individual is something that is an emergent property by way of a complex of factors that are strewn together in the organ that we call the brain. The brain is a complex, meaning it's a collection of structures, various neurological structures, insofar as that the brain is triune and a multi-faceted thing, insofar as that there is a reptilian brain, there is a mammalian brain, and there is a rational brain. There is a conscious aspect to the brain, and there is a subconscious aspect to the brain. One that's concerned with the brain is also bilaterally symmetric, giving it two different hemispheric curvatures or partitions to it, essentially, making it left and right, and you have the corpus callosum tying the two together. Is to say this, that a structure that seems as one is really separate compartments being aggregated and brought together to create a greater whole. It's where the traces of evolutionary history, at least evolutionary history, can be traced by way of the structure of the brain, of how it's brought itself up from lower levels of cognition and the arrangement of bundles of neuronal fibers and so on and so forth. It's just that it's a complex structure, and this complex structure is the sole arbiter and constructor of our vantage point in our reality as people. There is also this to say that the brain is structured by evolutionary means. But its nature is acting on the organisms in the environment and on human beings over time that creates the brain that we do see in our current vantage point, in our current light. And there are different modes of perception and being in the world. Bats fundamentally are not visually based as we are, and they experience the world through their ears and through sonar. Fish experience the world through electromagnetic spectrums, or just magnetic waves. Dogs and most other mammals experience the world through an olfactory sensual basis. Same for rats and mice. They're not visual creatures as human beings are. They're smelling creatures. They're hearing creatures. They're magnetism creatures. Or they're a type of creature that is visually based insofar as it sees a different inflection of the electromagnetic spectrum than we do in terms of white light. So to each of us, reality is a different thing. Though we are all organisms, we're experiencing a fundamentally different landscape than one another. And a dog would not have the same things and relevant bits of information to convey to a human being if they could speak. Same thing with a fish or a bat. They would be quite vexed in trying to understand, and we would be quite vexed in trying to understand what it is they're interested in and why they have the concerns that they do have, though there are many similarities that are cross-special, and especially through mammals and even through crustaceans and fish. There is a difference insofar as we experience the world fundamentally different, so we do not have the same vantage point on reality. So it then sends one to think, well, what is reality, and can any individual truly know what exists out in the world? And the logical answer is no. The empirical answer is no, but the logical answer and deductive answer is no, because Descartes raised this question as how do I know, insofar as my experience, that my brain is not being controlled by some demon or evil spirit, and that they are creating the representation in my mind, and that it is my mind that's coming up with the representation of the world, and that that's not the physical world itself. How do we know that we can trust the senses? And it's to say that the senses' role and the senses' place in our cognition and psyche is to help us make practical decisions in terms of our survival, per se. We are engineers insofar as we are trying to engineer our survival by being able to pay attention and differentiate information in the environment, and that's the role that they serve for us, and they help us act and act on the world. And our thoughts are sort of lined up and predicated with this mode of being, insofar as we mostly break the world up not into purely objects like my mind does, but objects insofar as their basis of meaning. Roughly, it looks like that's how most people look at things, is things being barriers or tools. Do things get me what I want, or do things keep me from what I want? And the mind is going to give one a shot of dopamine if they collect and move towards the things that get them what they want, or a shot of serotonin, not serotonin, but cortisol, sorry to blank on the name for a second. Cortisol, and essentially the stress hormone, if we're not getting towards what we want and being pushed more towards barriers, essentially. And it's to say that reality, whatever it is, we cannot completely know it. We cannot access it. And it's why things like quantitative reasoning and the scientific method was invented because fundamentally our intuitions fail us, our senses fail us, and empiricism is based off of what can be observed, but truly empiricism is based off of what can be quantified and what can be measured. It is through observation that we are doing it, but observation not in terms of our eyes, though we need our eyes to look at the dials and things like that. It's quantitation and observation on a larger scale, accepting the limitations of the defective objects, essentially, or instruments we have naturally, and ascertaining what the ultimate characteristic and nature of reality is. And I cannot know what reality is completely as a human being. So there is this doubt in me about reality being what I perceive it to be, or reality being what people naturally perceive it to be, and the fact that knowledge per se is derived from our experience, which consequently and logically it has to be. There are aspects that are a priori, and there are aspects of our knowledge that is a posteriori, insofar as things that come prior to our experience and things that come post our experience. But the a posteriori knowledge is from our experience, and the a priori knowledge is from our evolutionary history. It is still finding itself in the a posteriori basis. Insofar as that organisms, I don't think that they are blank slates and that they ever were blank slates and canvases, but that organisms do come from single-celled, smaller ordered organisms, and you get the more complex organisms as you move up the evolutionary chain and phylum. But that anything that you will find as an a priori bit of knowledge and the human conscious was put there by way of evolutionary history, and it is very difficult to know when experience and the natural notions ever separated from one another, and what causes what. It is an interplay between the environment and the organism acting on one another, essentially, that creates the evolutionary history that we see now. It's not as one-sided as just the environment acting on us, but it is that the environment acts on organisms and the organisms act back on the environment, and there's this interplay, and there's this interplay between the communication of our genetic makeup and the environment that we find ourselves in, and it's quite difficult to know where to really parsimony and separate the two and know where one starts and where the other ends, essentially, in most aspects. It's not like that with every factor per se, but it's like that for most things that are important, or at least we find salient and relevant to our investigations of what is the fundamental nature of reality and can we know it. There's many things we can't know, and primarily one cannot know, at least logically, if their experience is a real thing, if they're really experiencing the world, or if they really exist. And that is something that my mind is absolutely and fully aware of, though I very much present facts and logic and talk about empirical things. I will now turn my attention to the scientific method and its limitations, though I present a great deal of scientific logic and reasoning in my thoughts. And it's to say this, that science is fundamentally based on quantitative reasoning and measurement and fact. Now, the limitation insofar as in measurement is that measurement can only be good as the apparatus and the observer of the apparatus. There cannot be necessarily the perfect measurement, and that's why there are measuring errors, or formulas and equations for error calculation. And there's a whole school of mathematics based on error analyses. And we're going to always have to live with, and I'm trying not to turn melancholic as I say this, with the fact that knowledge will always be imperfect, per se, and that any measurement that we get is not going to be completely the most accurate representation. We will try to get to the thousandth, as many decimal places as we can, up to 16 to 15 to 20 to 24, all the way to 38 and 40 decimal places. But at the end, it's only an inductive argument and can only be strong. It can never be sound. It will not ever be absolute. It will only be a representation. And it's a representation of a reality we cannot be certain of nonetheless. So there is this limitation. And insofar as this, that when science said the only thing that is important is what can be quantified, fundamentally and logically it cut out a very large portion of knowledge that could possibly be ascertained from the environment, and what brings the natural contention between the objectivity of science and the subjectivity of faith, per se, and is that you can't quantify things, you can't quantify people, you can't quantify certain aspects of the human experience, so they're not important, and you disavow them essentially in an offhand way. Though science has very much made sure in the recent centuries that it has tried to rectify that aspect of itself. It's not even the greatest crime per se, but the thing is that we are creating models, and we are consistently creating models and representations. We are creating models and representations by way of faulty measurements. We don't need to be completely accurate to get results per se, and to be pragmatic and to make things happen. But when we're asking about the ultimate nature of reality, there is a very real frustration in the limitations of what it is we can ascertain from our measurement, and the need for technology to continue to advance and proliferate itself to even greater heights for us to be able to get a better picture. It's somewhat of the reason why physics is stuck, because we can't analyze and we can't measure and quantify the things that have the greatest amount of concern to us. And even when we do, there will be no way to know that it is ultimately and completely true. It is what's most likely. So objective reality is something that's very hard for an organism such as ourselves to obtain, and then even the means that we have created in terms of mathematics and science, there is a limitation in their abilities to ascertain it for us. And it's to say this, that we can't be certain of much. We really can't. And it's to go further and to say that even with logic, it depends on the type and school of logic that one is going from. But particularly formal logic is based on form. It's not based on the premises themselves. You can have a valid argument that's not true. And insofar as one search for the truth, one can be very much misled by just pure deduction if their premises are faulty. You need sound premises, and you need valid induction, essentially. You need valid facts to be deductively sound. It's what one needs. If you start with untrue premises, you don't have a sound argument. You can't actually know the truth by pure deduction, intuition. One must intuit that the rational approach is the best approach to begin with, per se, because at the bottom there is a fairly fuzzy layer, and one cannot be certain of the grounds in which they stand. It is intuition that leads to rationality. It is intuition that ultimately leads to logic. It's where the quotation that logic is fuzzy on both ends, and that an INTP should ultimately understand this, comes from. And it's one that is very disconcerting to me, or I should say sorrowful to me. I don't like it, but it is the truth. And one cannot know things, not in the way that people spontaneously accept that they can. There will be nothing that is necessarily going to save us, per se. We have thought to make artificial intelligence and to continue to increase the scope of what our technology is capable of, and even in making it greater than us in certain capacities. But still, we're finding that the technology is limited unless the technology can learn and exceed what we can understand by way of its stature and its ability to learn and think for itself, i.e. the need for artificial intelligence. But then when you get to that question, there becomes moral ramifications and ethical ramifications, insofar that we find ourselves in an impasse. We can never really know if the universe isn't a complete hologram, and we can't ever really know if we're ever getting at the truth. We can never be completely certain of a measurement, and we can never be sure, per se, outside of our own practical experience and a very strict adherence to pragmatism, if something's true. And it's in science to where a very real bent towards what's true is what works, what shows itself to be effective and efficient. And that's not necessarily absolute truth insofar as how one would be concerned with it in the school of formal logic, metaphysics, or epistemology. That's one type of an epistemological vantage point, but it's not the classical sense. And there is just this very deep and ambiguous water that one finds themselves as a logical thinker wading through if they truly test everything. And it's to say that I can't even be certain of my own thoughts. I am fundamentally an evolved thing, and I do not know what every center of my mind is doing, and necessarily where it's leading me, per se, in my conscious actions, and the will and the volition that underlies my actions. Because things are subconscious doesn't mean that they're not there and that they don't exist, and that they won't manifest themselves in peculiar ways in my behaviors and what I find myself doing, rather than what I don't find myself doing. Insofar as that I'm stuck in a lot of ways just being able to completely know the world and completely know myself. It's that is my existential burden, and it's to say that I can't know things, and that I don't think people can know what sort of angst and anxiety that leads me in as a person who's bent towards logic and reason, particularly my own subjective logic. And this is a bridge, if something I always find myself dealing with, and that the whole field of mathematics, something that I am very passionate about, is a system, is an axiomatic system that's rested on assumptions that you must accept. You don't, there's no good reason to accept them other than that you must accept them if you are wanting to come to some conclusion about something, one must have assumptions as the basis of their thoughts, or they're not able to come to conclusions. And it's our intuition that, or a form of intuition that rests as our assumptions. And much of our intuition is constructed from our environment and what we see over time, and it's another form of expectation. Just when are you getting at, and when is one getting at what is true and what one can know? And can one ever actually get to it and know it? And many thinkers who've dealt with this have said that the truth is a lot like an asymptote, and we may not be able to get to it or ever reach it, but we can approximate and gradually approach it, and it's very asymptotical. But that's the most positive view, and it's not. It does, and that's not necessarily true. It's being optimistic, quite honestly. We don't know how much we don't know. It's sadly to say, we don't know how far what is actually the makeup of the world we're living in, per se, because there are different things that are showing up each and every time in our empirical investigation. There's always something that is, nothing is ever going to be static and complete, and it's always going to be changing. The problem with fact is that it's largely based on consensus. And facts, I don't need to tell anyone that facts are always going to change. And that's the nature of facts. It's not if they'll change. It's when will they change, why do they change, and that's all that there ever will be. It's why I'm somewhat skeptical of them, per se, and why I don't ever stop at them, per se, and I don't find myself being conservative around them, because you can't trust them necessarily. And then it's to say, even with logic, you can't trust it necessarily. Just what can one trust, per se? And why does one want to be able to trust something if we are completely rational? It's a paradox, it's a puzzle. And it's a place that I found myself very much stumped. And I wound up saying that there's no point to thinking, there's no point to trying to know things, there's no point in trying to figure out things. I was very nihilistic in this manner, because one can't know. And I would look at the world and think how foolish and how feeble you are. The conclusions you come to, even outside of even within the cage that you live in, because I very much thought of it as a cage, are completely asinine and off the mark and are inaccurate. But then at the same time, you don't see the cage you live in. You don't see the paradox of the observer. You don't see the limitations of knowledge. You don't see the limitations of rationality. You don't see the limitations of reason. It is the very end of rationality to prove the limitations of rationality. It is the very end of logic to show the end of logic. It's always that there is an end. There's a place where it stops working. It just stops working and it breaks down. Everything is incomplete. And I don't know if I'm trying not to be as anxious when I'm speaking about this, but it's true. And it made me fundamentally nihilistic, and it's why I can't live here. Why I can accept that, but what I do with that is be existential in my existence and saying that it is absurd, and it's something that I will be always faced with, and it's a very dark and ominous thing that's staring me in the face. But I will say that if I cannot think, if I cannot reason, if I cannot use logic, if I can't investigate, nor figure things out, there is no point for me. I really have no reason. And I can find no reason. And unfortunately, that's just how my existence is. So I cannot indulge in those thoughts, per se. I cannot live in that space. And I found that out by way of going to a very, very dark place. And though it's where many INTPs may find themselves at some point in time in their life, I would say this from an ethical and just from an ethical standpoint, if your beliefs, I think this roughly insofar as a moral precept, that the truth brings life and that lies bring death. I'm not saying that what I said was a lie, but I'm saying this, that it very well may be that all that I said previously is true. And logically, I cannot see why it's not. But I think biologically, insofar as ethically, and morally, as a entity and an agent, that whatever semblance of emotion I have, and whatever leaning I have, is towards one of inquiry, investigation, and thought, then I must continue to persist on despite the disappointment and despite reality, and in the face of reality. I must swallow the absurdity, to steal something from Nietzsche. I simply swallow the toad, but I must insist on, or else there will be no insistence. There will, I promise you, and I mean this very really, that if I don't do this, there is nothing else that I'm concerned with or that I care about ultimately. There is nothing else that this world offers me. There's nothing else I can see worth the hassle, per se. So it is why, though I know these things to be realities, per se, and I know it's the darker, more horrific and terrifying side of knowledge, I must continue to tend towards the light, because there's only one other thing waiting for me on the other side, and that's either death or a totalitarian regime. And as an individual who likes to be autonomous and doesn't really want to subjugate themselves to anything, I'm not going down that road. And as an individual now who puts some of his eggs in the basket of humanism and the need for community and other people, I will not live there, because there is a need, per se, from the INTP to be the arbiter of truth and to be the patron saint of epistemology. And so long as there is that role for all INTPs, and not just for myself, in some capacity, and so long as I can continue to derive subjective and intrinsic meaning from my investigations and logic, I will persist in a joyful manner. But it is also the darker aspects, per se, to what it means to be human, and about knowledge. And Lord Byron, had a quote that said this, that sorrow should be the teacher of the wise, for they who know the most, mourn the most. Oh, the faithful truth, that the tree of knowledge was not the one of life. Knowledge is sorrow. And there's another way that it's said that sorrow should be the teacher of the wise, for knowledge is sorrow. Or the faithful truth, that the tree of knowledge was not that one of life. And that's what I know, and I see. I just don't. It stares at me, and it's always with me. I don't indulge it, and I don't feed it. But that is on knowledge per se, and a very real look and vantage point into what's behind some of my actions and why I approach things the way I do per se, and why I may appear a little different from other INTPs in this respect. I found myself to be able to be completely rational and logical until I saw the death of logic in my world, and I saw the death of knowledge and reason in my world, and the complete absurdity that it presented me with. And I could not live in that space, per se. It made, and living in it, if it did not take my life, it made me completely apathetic and unengaged in reality. But there was another way, and there was something I found that would be an aid to me and my continual recapitulation of the ritual that is the contention and contradiction of human existence. And that is the cross I bear and my existential burden, and it's what I think is the fundamental truth of knowledge, per se, but don't despair, for there is a true need for knowledge in the hands of humanity, and there is a need in the greater fraternity of humanity to have those who can create knowledge structures, who can face uncertainty, who can face the limitations, who can face the mystery, and be joyous and receive a great deal of awe, wonder, passion, and inspiration from these things, and have a passion for the abstractions, and seek to pursue them. And that is my place, and that's where I find myself, and that's what I do. And that's the fundamental aspect of my existence, though that there are other things that come with it, as me being a biological entity per se, or me being human fundamentally, as in I'm social and I'm biologically based, so I will care about sex, and I will care about relationships to a certain extent, and I will care about these other things, but they don't do the same things for me as logic and intellectualism does, and I derive almost all of my meaning and esteem from my own ingenuity and autonomy, and I cannot corrupt these things, or else I cannot be. So that's my video, and that's on knowledge, and I promised the next video. I didn't even really like doing this, but I had to say this so that the truth could be known. Thank you for watching.